there are difficult messages that managers need to give. Having those difficult conversations is imperative. You cannot avoid those situations. So yes, a complaint may come up. Yes, we may need to look at it if it can't be resolved informally.
Welcome to the Human Side of Business podcast with me, Louisa Meehan. We're exploring real stories from the trenches of people management. Each episode explores the situations business leaders have actually faced, the wins that surprised them, the failures that told them, the funny moments that kept them sane, and the challenging times that tested their resolve. We dig into what worked, what spectacularly didn't work, and the lessons learned along the way. This is about the messy, unpredictable, rewarding reality of managing humans, not the sanitized version you read about in business books. Today, we meet with Rosanne Edger of Edger HR Consulting. Rosanne is a senior HR professional with over 20 years' experience across a wide range of sectors, including professional services, retail, manufacturing, technology, life sciences, and many others. Having operated at a HR director level, Rosanne has a strong track record in HR leadership, strategy setting, support, guidance, and project delivery. She has helped both startups and established businesses strengthen their people strategies and mitigate risk, and has an excellent commercial understanding with the ability to marry HR and business agendas. Please join me in welcoming Rosanne. Rosanne, thank you so much for coming along today. I'm delighted to have you here. We've known each other for a super long time, since before either of us were HR professionals. So back, let's just say a few years ago in Smurfit when we were training.
Correct. Yeah.
We learned a few things along the way. So that's the point of the conversation today, I suppose, to talk about some of those lessons we've learned along the way and how the classroom has really come to life over the years.
Absolutely. Bringing the academia, but bringing the reality of it all on a day-to-day basis as well. So it is for sure.
Exactly.
And a lot of learning in the interim.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And I suppose, if you were to think back on your career as a HR person and you could go back all of those years, we won't say how many years it is, what would the one nugget of advice be that you would give to yourself, like the one lesson that you've learned that really stands out in terms of the real world versus the picture perfect world in academia?
I suppose it's always kind of being open, being open to what you're seeing, what you're hearing, never assuming. Not everything is as it seems. I suppose, when it comes to different employee relations matters, there's always two sides to every story, but it really is just being open and just kind of constantly looking beyond, not making your own assumptions on things. And just keeping an open mind.
Yeah, I think for me, it would be probably the exact same. I know in my very early days in the hospital, I had an employee come and tell me how awful her manager was. And I fell hook, line and sinker, believed everything she said, couldn't believe that this person was allowed to be in the hospital alone work. And then I met with him and I spoke with my boss and I was like, oh, okay, so there's this whole other story going on. And actually she's got massive performance issues and she does this all the time. And that openness has been absolutely key.
Yeah.
And over the years, I know we were just talking, you've done a lot of work in relation to dealing with grievances and disciplinaries. So before we get into some of the examples, do you just want to explain why having the policies and procedures in place is so important for anybody who maybe is still at that stage?
I would be an advocate of having policies and procedures there. I know that there are maybe some organisations who like to have very minimalist policies, but I think when it comes to the area really of transparency and everybody being on the same page, But, really understanding, one, what do I do if I have an issue? Mm-hmm. And that could be as an employee, or that could be as a manager. And I'm not saying that policies need to be extremely prescriptive. It shouldn't be an operating procedure, but it really should give people, what do I do in this situation? How do I start? And I suppose then, with that in mind, it gives a framework to how do I approach this? So it gives people the knowledge behind the scenes, maybe before something escalates, what they do if they have an issue with something. But then as you're kind of working through that matter, it really does give a framework. And to me, as I say, it's very much around just being transparent, being fair, everybody kind of knowing what to do and what might be coming next.
Yeah, and I mean, it's fair to say that doing that before you need it is immeasurably easier than doing it in the middle of a crisis. Because sometimes then it's a little bit too late and you have to go with the statutory box rather than what's the right fit for your business.
Absolutely. And that's absolutely key. And that's what I would, and I, obviously I'm working in consultancy at the moment, and, you can see where organizations have maybe got something from somebody else, or they've taken a very templated version. And then when the problem comes to light and they're trying to work through it, they're just they're so bogged down in, this isn't actually working. This isn't working for us. So one of the key things that I really do is I'm kind of supporting clients. And if I'm working with clients on their policies or procedures, it really is, what is the culture of your organization? What is it that's meaningful to you? How do you see this really operating in practice? So that when and maybe if it kind of gets to that point, it's easier, I think. But
I would agree. I mean, the one thing I would say, and I was just talking about this yesterday, is I think these policies need to be seen as living documents. So if you go through a really difficult process, there's no policy that's perfect. You always learn lessons. So tweak, change, correct, update.
Absolutely.
Because I'm doing HR just as yourself, and I learn new things every week. There's nothing as strange as people, and something always comes up where you're like, I wasn't expecting that.
Yeah. No, absolutely. And again, I says the policy isn't supposed to cover every single possible situation that could, because we'll never we'll never have the foresight to be able to figure all of that out. That comes with hindsight, right?
Yes.
But absolutely, it is. It's so important. And again, updating regularly, and yes, maybe best practice would be pick it up every year, look back at it. In reality, does that happen even in large organizations? Probably not. But regular reviews are really important, because your business evolves. Your culture changes. What is important, it changes with time as well. And as you say, a situation arises, or there's new legal developments, and that needs to be reflected then as we work forward.
No, absolutely. So listen, getting into some of the real life situations, can you share with us, without obviously naming organizations or people, can you share with us maybe an interesting example of a type of grievance that would come up maybe on a fairly regular basis, and how you would address it?
I suppose a lot of the grievances really kind of come down to those kind of workplace interactions. I suppose, there's always, as I said, there couldn't be two sides to every story, so you do see quite a lot, and there is a lot of talk, even really in that kind of post-COVID piece, around dissatisfaction, around the workplace, and increase in grievances. Like I'm seeing kind of complaints being raised, but, it might be as a result of maybe absence management. It might be as a result of performance management more often. So you tend to kind of see a merge of various policies or various issues kind of happening simultaneously. And it's really around kind of just trying to work through one at a time. So, it could be a performance management piece with a grievance. It could be a disciplinary piece with a grievance. But it's really, I suppose, just taking a step back, pausing the disciplinary or the performance management if you need to. That's not always that's not always the absolute required approach. Depends on what the complaint is. But it's really just about kind of taking a step back and working through each process bit by bit.
And I think, you mentioned their performance management, and it's one of the areas that I would come across quite a bit, is where you can have an employee who is maybe on the verge of going into a performance improvement plan, or perhaps in one, and they're not happy about it. They disagree with it. They think actually they're the best employee ever. And what I find in those situations is it is quite common that employee will then say that they're being harassed or bullied or mismanaged by their line manager. And so one of the things is that you have to prepare the line manager. How are you going to deal with that when it happens? And how do you protect yourself? So what steps would you recommend?
In terms of talking to the manager and preparing them, or in relation to dealing with that complaint as and when it...
Well, I suppose firstly preparing the line manager and then dealing with the complaint.
Yeah. So again, in terms of sort of the preparation, obviously each allegation that's made, if the allegation comes up, we are going to need to look into it and thoroughly. But again, I suppose in terms of sort of preparing the manager, what I would generally say is these can happen. People can make complaints about anything. It doesn't always mean that it's justified or there's anything that's going to back that up. But the point is, everybody has a right to do so. It does happen. And we'll just, again, kind of work. We as in maybe separately to that person, but obviously it'll need to be worked through. And I suppose from a real life example, I was in a situation many years ago where an employee didn't like the message that I was giving, and they very much just kept asking the same question. I obviously had to keep giving them the same answer, which they didn't like. And they raised a grievance about me and how I was kind of just repeating myself and, not giving them the required information. But again, I suppose in a sense, I didn't like that. Of course, I didn't. But at the end of the day, they had the opportunity to do so. The company had to follow the procedures. And again, I was just working through a situation with them, and there you go. So it is just one of those things, So and I suppose, there are difficult messages that managers need to give.
Yes.
And being a manager is extremely difficult. But having those difficult conversations is imperative. You cannot avoid those situations. So yes, a complaint may come up. Yes, we may need to look at it if it can't be resolved informally.
Yeah.
That doesn't mean you should shy away and avoid that conversation. And I'm a big advocate that, I think, that is a real skill. One, because skill that's lacking. One, because none of us really like to have difficult conversations. We don't prefer to have a nice conversation than a difficult one. But also, it is, it's something that I really think people should be skilled at, and it should really form part of kind of all basic managerial training.
Yes.
Because it's one of those key aspects. The functional piece you can work through, but it is really one of those kind of, for want, softer skills, which it's not. It's a hard skill, but it really is something that managers need to focus on, and something I suppose we as HR professionals need to coach and support them through in terms of how best to have those conversations.
No, I couldn't agree more. And you're I'm remembering, or you're having me recall a situation a few years ago. I had a manager who had to give some feedback to a relatively junior member of staff, but this member of staff was very strongly connected through her dad into sort of the CEO and senior positions within that organization, and a parent organization or a partner organization. So she was very connected in the industry, so had to be managed carefully so as not to rock the boat. Anyway, this manager goes in, has a conversation with her, which was the step just before putting her onto a performance improvement plan. So it was, you got to fix your performance here, or we're going into a more difficult situation. What support, what training do we need to give you to do that? And I didn't go into the meeting because we wanted it to be very, I suppose, be less impactful on her from that perspective. So it was just a one-to-one meeting, which was easier for her. The manager came out and said, "Oh, that went well," and I got my message across. And I was like, "Okay." And then I was speaking with her later, and she was like, "I had a great meeting, and my manager thinks I'm brilliant, and they're going to send me on this training, and it's so amazing, and it's fantastic." And I was sitting there going, "That wasn't the message you were supposed to get." Yeah, we want you to get some training, but not because you're great. It's actually and it's the opposite. And I think it is, one of the things I've been accused of over the years, and not maybe accused of, giving the feedback on, is that I can be quite direct.
Yeah.
It works to I've learned to temper it and control it better. But it does work to my advantage, because there are situations where you need to deliver a message to somebody that they're not going to want to hear. And so in delivering that message, if you try and beat around the bush, they don't hear it. They hear what they want to hear. So you have to get to the point, be direct, come back then, as I say, the next day, and then give them the nice sort of arm around the shoulder. How can we fix this together? But make sure that they know that there's a problem.
Yeah. 100%, they have to walk out, realizing. And I suppose, what I always, say is, yes, be direct, to the point, have your examples, be prepared, so that so not that it's so scripted that you're sitting there with a script and it sounds like, you're not there, it's like, you've got your head down, I think again, that's a real skill. And it's amazing when you see managers who, have all of the information in their head, and, and with some bullet points, but they can really sort of get that message across while kind of keeping the connection with
It's the being authentic, isn't it?
Absolutely.
Yeah.
But I always say that is the importance, because some managers can be really good at that and, in the room, but there is still the important step of afterwards, follow it up in writing, because sometimes, it's like they will only hear, one or two things. They didn't get the full story, because again, it's the type of meeting where it's not fully scripted or fully noted, there's no minutes of that happening. But again, for clarity, sometimes people really only absorb that when they see it in black and white. They really know, I need to pull my socks up now, because, okay, this is what's going to happen. And sometimes people do just kind of miss that step, even though the message has been delivered, but the employee just forgets certain aspects.
Yeah.
Only hears some of what they wanted to. And I would stress the importance of kind of closing that circle as well, in a nice way. You can do it in a nice, not overly formal kind of correspondence. But
I'm not sure if my correspondence is always as nice as people would like it to be, unfortunately, because you do sometimes have to deliver something in writing that makes for difficult reading. And I know certainly. Say, for example, if I'm doing an exit package and we might have gone through a difficult negotiations with an employee and got to the point where we can put in writing, here's what's being agreed, here's what you're going to get, you're not going to sue us, whatever that might be. I always pre-warn them that the letter is very legal and it's very cold and clinical, but that doesn't mean that the relationship is. So sometimes if I have to do that, it's like, okay, this might not make for pleasant reading. Come and talk to me and let's put the two things together, because It is so important, but the delivering of the message in multiple different ways to ensure that what you are trying to communicate is what they are receiving is crucial in all aspects of HR.
Yes, absolutely. Absolutely.
So listen, I'm sure there's lots of people who'd be really interested in some of your more interesting disciplinary cases that you've dealt with. So from your perspective, what is the one, I suppose, that you have found most enlightening over the last few years?
Enlightening.
Or the most impactful for you?
Yeah, well, look, I suppose one that really kind of stands to me, and again, very much kind of going back to managers have a very difficult job.
Yes.
They are managing it. And we as HR professionals, we are familiar, we know the law, we are used to having certain conversations. We know generally and most of the time what to say, what not to say. But that's not always so easy for managers. So there was probably a short while ago, I was dealing with a employee that was a grievance and a disciplinary matter. So it had started with there were some complaints coming about the employee, and he then started to raise complaints, and he started to say how he was being treated unfairly. There was kind of references or inferences to sort of discrimination and things like that. And I suppose from the managerial perspective, I hadn't been involved in it at this particular stage. He was raising these issues and they just kept saying, no, you're not. No, this isn't happening. No, this isn't happening. But really, I suppose at a certain point in time, they should very much have directed him to the policies and said that if this is really how you feel, these are the policies, this is what you would do in that situation, rather than just trying to counter his situation without looking into what he was escalating. But so at this particular point in time, we had obviously the disciplinary related matters that they needed to sort of progress. There was these kind of complaints that were brewing at the same time, but he was, and I suppose it was one of the most difficult situations that I would recall as a HR professional, and not so much because of what we were dealing with. There was the process, and it is always, as I think I've kind of said to a little kind of short while ago, you break it down one step at a time, and you will get there.
Yes.
But you kind of go back to basics and one step at a time. But the individual was complex, and there was a lot going on. But in order for him to get the answers that he really wanted, he would ring and ring and ring and ring, and he would, keep people in the office on the, in the, his manager or, other people in the team on the phone. But again, he would ring and ask the same question again and again and again and again. And this situation was that they just didn't know what they should or shouldn't really be saying. And eventually it got handed over to me. And at least then I could manage that communication. But when I say that the calls were incessant, like it was, I could be on a meeting and my phone would start ringing, and I could get 30 or 40 calls from him in a day,
Oh, wow.
I could, you could be on a meeting for half an hour or an hour and you'd have 9 missed calls from him. And again, like that, obviously I have other commitments and you're dealing with other matters. But when you would get to call, when you would get to speak with him again, it was the same thing again and again and again. And, things like it would be very much, at the end of the day, my impression was he wanted to be dismissed. But obviously, in order to do so, we needed to follow a process to make that fair. And he, would say things like, you're forcing me to be employed. We're not forcing you to be employed.
You wouldn't let him resign, Rosanne, clearly.
Yeah, you always have a choice, you always have a choice. But and look, as it turned out, he wouldn't attend any of the meetings. He wouldn't, attend meetings to deal with his grievance. We had to get, external people involved. Again, the calls would start with those individuals. And it just went on and on and on. And it was a situation where, as I say, the matters we were dealing with were not so complex, but there was a lot of complexity to the individual. And it did occur to me at one point that, he could end up outside my house,
I've had that fear a couple of times.
So I suppose that kind of stands to me. So because, as I say, managers are dealing with maybe, thankfully in my sort of 25 year career, that is one of those kind of real kind of fear moments. But at the same time, those kind of things do happen, like I've had situations where, I've dismissed people, and there's one particular that stands out, that unfortunately there was a kind of harassment, intimidation. There was a real manipulation of their employees taking place, that I was involved in dismissing a husband and a wife the week before Christmas.
And the husband and wife together?
And wife together.
Amazing.
Yes. The week before Christmas. And, walking back to my car that night, I really did think, I should have got somebody to walk with me, but I didn't think of that until I was sort of halfway across the dark, quiet car park. And again, I suppose it really is just around, as managers, are obviously dealing with this, as HR professionals, we're dealing with very difficult situations where you are trying to look out for the company, look out for all of the employees, even the ones you are, involved in terminating. But yeah, who's also kind of supporting us through those kind of difficult scenarios.
No, and it is. I know certainly a situation a few years ago when I was dismissing somebody who did know where I lived. He was certainly on some sort of intoxicant, but he accused me of starting the London fires and being racist and burning down buildings because I was a racist, and various other things. It's intimidating. It is intimidating. But I think you just have to, game face on, and you can't let that be seen. One of the things in your story that struck me is the importance within all businesses, but most certainly within the SME sector, because it gets much more tricky. It's about having different people for the different steps. So if somebody's raising a grievance and then there's disciplinary and maybe another grievance, you can have sometimes the same people involved in those different processes, and sometimes you can't. So how do you support businesses in figuring that out?
Yes, and it is, I will always say we have to think to that kind of end game. We have to think, where could this go, and how many people do we think we need involved in this, and really does this more senior person, as much as they maybe want to do it, to not have somebody else in their team get involved, but really questioning that, because does that senior person really need to be involved at this stage? Because they may be needed in two scenarios forward.
Yes.
But very much, look, I suppose, especially, and it's hard in larger organizations, but it is extremely difficult in the SME sector. So yes, I suppose there are occasions where they have to look externally.
Yeah.
For that support, one from a technical and kind of functional expertise, because obviously people doing investigations should really be trained and be competent, and organizations can be criticized if that's not the case. But I suppose always kind of looking at, are the matters, overlapping? Are they linked? Can we justify this? And I suppose in some senses, you do need to have those kind of lines of, I suppose, those Chinese walls in a sense between different things.
Yep.
But at the end of the day, are, kind of challenging myself as a HR person, could this person be involved in that investigation, but in as in that maybe grievance investigation, but not necessarily in but they might have been involved in a disciplinary. So also kind of challenging yourself as a HR person to kind of say, could this be looked at? And again, it's always around the risk appetite, because if it's a low level sanction, it may be not as important as if it has the potential to end up in a dismissal.
Yeah, and I think that's really important. We go into any disciplinary process not knowing what the outcome will be. And I know for sure I've gone in sometimes expecting a dismissal and ending up with a lower sanction and vice versa.
Yeah.
But with 20 years experience, you do get a good sense at the investigation stage that this has the potential to end up in a disciplinary or in a dismissal. And so then you do need to take different steps to just protect the organization, an extra layer of protection. And I'm sure that you've been brought in, similar to myself, to be the decision maker at times, whether it's a disciplinary decision at stage one where you're deciding, dismissal is appropriate, or potentially an appeal because they've ran out of people internally.
Yes.
And so they have to outsource the decision to a competent person.
Yes.
And that's a difficult thing for an organization to do. I always feel very privileged that they would trust me to make that decision, because it's a huge piece. So do you want to maybe talk about a situation where you were brought in to make a decision?
I suppose in relation to a grievance, really, and again, in that hearing, very much kind of being that decision maker. So there had been a situation I'm thinking of is that there had been a bullying claim made against another member of the team.
Okay.
They did actually initially appoint somebody internally, and I was supposed to be the HR person supporting them. But as it turned out, the manager didn't necessarily feel that level of competence himself. So even though he himself agreed with everything that was happening as part of that investigation, it so turned out that he didn't want to go the full way as such. So I was there really then at that point to effectively take over, lead that piece to conclusion, and issue that and issue that decision as it stood. So yeah, I don't know if that kind of.
No, for sure. And I think actually, there's certain situations that I've dealt with where they may have somebody internally, but the community, either within the organization or the connection between people who work in the organization and the wider community in the society that they're operating within, is very, very tight knit and very close. And so sometimes the manager, similar to what you're saying, they can say, look, I can see where this is going. I don't want to be a decision maker here because of the personal repercussions, or because it's not appropriate, because of conflicts of interest. So sometimes it's not just about not having the right people or enough people. It's going, if we can outsource this really painful piece of the process, then we're going to do that.
Yes.
I think you shouldn't be afraid of doing that, but you do have to be very careful who you pick to work with.
Absolutely. And, there is, I suppose there's kind of two things that kind of come to mind. One, I would always say, obviously, in some senses, it can be, if they want support throughout a process, then, obviously I as HR cannot then be a decision maker.
Yes.
So it's very much around just making that clear that, potentially I could be there as support, or somebody else from a HR perspective could be brought in to give them the support. And then either myself or maybe another consultant could kind of, jump in at different levels of at different levels of the process. But the other thing that, I was kind of thinking is that I suppose as part of that, sometimes it may be more appropriate for an organization to have the external person brought in at an earlier stage in the process, because I suppose it is your organization. And, at the end of the day, businesses make decisions occasionally. What's right for the business, there can be extremely difficult employees. So, for example, I had a situation, and this was before I started supporting this particular client as a consultant, but an employee or an ex-employee had come in, punched another member of staff, and they sacked him there and then on the spot. And, they absolutely, it was a very, very small kind of family run business. And I said to them, okay, they were fighting, not fighting with me, but they were certainly arguing, putting their point across, but we did the right thing. You did the right thing for the business and for the employees. You just did it in the wrong way.
Yeah.
And I suppose as part of that, it very much is, it is all around the process. But at the end of the day, they felt that, they didn't necessarily want somebody coming in as an appeal and overturning that decision, which any appeal manager is going to have to do in effect,
yes.
Because the process isn't complied with. So I suppose I always sort of say, if you are getting somebody external, if you don't know, I suppose, their modus operandi, then, very much, maybe get them involved in an earlier stage, because it does retain that decision, and you may decide to take a risk on that decision because maybe it is the right thing for your business, but you have to do that with, I suppose, that full knowledge that there is a risk attached to that decision.
No, and I think like what you're really talking about there in a lot of ways is, I suppose it's an area of HR that a lot of small business owners, until they come across it, they don't realize it, which is if someone comes in and punches their colleague, if you literally catch them taking money out of the till, so whatever version of that is for your business. So you've caught them red-handed, that what you're saying they did, absolutely categorically without question they did it, and it is a dismissible offence. Most people, or a lot of people, think then you can just sack them on the spot. Yeah. And they don't realize that, no, you still have to go through an investigation process. You have to invite them to a disciplinary meeting. And that process, even when you're doing it very quickly, can take a number of weeks. Yeah. It's not something that you can do in 24 hours or in a few days. But that process is critical, because if you don't follow it, it doesn't matter how right you were, you've lost. And with unfair dismissals, you've lost before you started. And that would be advice. I'm sure you say the same when you're going through this process and supporting managers. One of the things that I always say is, if we want to dismiss this person, if you end up in the WRC, you've lost before you go in, because that's the law. Okay. It's considered unfair until you prove that it's fair. The probability is that the employee will win something. We don't know what that will be. We can mitigate that loss and we can follow the processes. Are you still happy with that risk? Is that still the right decision? If you were to go to the WRC and they turn around and say that you made the wrong decision, are you happy to defend it? Because that ultimately is what you can end up doing. And I'm sure that's something that you do with your managers too.
No, absolutely. And I suppose with that in mind, if there is an opportunity to potentially settle a case quicker, and I'm not talking about huge amounts of money, but there are situations where you can get a settlement agreement signed. I've exchanged situation in kind of complex matters, but somebody was obviously happy to have the problem go away. Like I've got into settlements for, 500-700 euros, and it might be grating to give said employee who has punched somebody or who has done something else or is causing your team, no end of bother, to hand over your checkbook, even if it is only for 700 euros or whatever.
Yeah.
It's really grating to managers who want to do the right thing. But at the end of the day, it will cost you endless amounts of time, energy, and a lot more money if you go down the route of the WRC. And
for sure.
And you'll still be talking about it in 8 to 12 to 18 months.
As long as it goes well.
Yeah.
No, and I think there are situations where the right thing to do is to turn around and say, no, like, we're not going to settle this and we're going to go to WRC, and that's
absolutely
fine. So, but I agree. If there's I always say to people, it's the path of least resistance. What is the easiest way out of this problem?
Yeah.
And if we need to take the difficult path, then let's do it. Like, we have the skills, we have the tools, techniques to do it, policies, procedures, all of that. But is there an easier option, and what does that look like?
Yeah. Well involved.
Sometimes it's a choice of a few different really not nice options.
For sure.
Okay, so listen, to get away from the sort of heavier side of it, what has been the funniest complaint that has come across your desk?
Funniest complaint?
Were any of them funny?
Open plan offices. Open plan offices seem to just create an endless amount of complaints, whether it's so-and-so talks too loud, or, so-and-so has something for their lunch.
Smelly lunches.
But yes, talking too loud, yes, I get it.
I know, I do. I say to people sometimes, if you want to play it, like, have mischief, get into the office before anybody else is there and just move some chairs around.
Yeah.
You will cause utter chaos.
Utter chaos.
Not that we're recommending chaos, but sometimes, sometimes you move forward.
Yes, no, that's it. And, this is, the whole thing, with the move to hot desks and stuff like that. But people still, this is my desk,
Oh, yeah.
And
I have to admit, I'm not a big, I wouldn't love the whole hot desking thing. I have too many bits and too much stuff.
I know, I get it. I did work in an organization once upon a time where it was definitely a director, if not, it was the MD, and he would go around in the evening with a plastic bag and take everybody's personal belongings and put them in the plastic bag.
Extra jobs.
These are hot desks. These are not your station.
Oh, wow. But people are creatures of habit, and they like sort of comfort and routine.
They do. And look, I guess it's a balance, isn't it? We want people to be comfortable in work. We spend a lot of time there, right?
Fantastic.
But yeah. So that was one that used to make me giggle when you'd see him with his plastic bag.
That is a new one to me. So you learn something new every day in this world.
Yes,
I must buy some plastic bags for my CEOs.
Yes.
Okay, listen, thank you so much. Before we finish, I have decided to borrow a tradition from the Diary of a CEO, where they have the last guest leave a question for the next guest. So we're going to do that. So these are totally random questions.
Yes.
So the question for you, without knowing who it's from, is: when will you know or think that you have enough?
From a HR perspective, I presume.
I think it's in life, because they didn't know they were leaving it for somebody in HR. So in your life, when you know you have enough.
Enough. I'm going to take that more from a career perspective than like cash.
Okay.
Is there ever enough of that?
So we're not finding out what's in your bank balance. That's okay.
With 2 kids, I think that I could never have enough. But that's
the endless ATM machine.
When will I have enough? From a career perspective, look, it took me a while. I didn't know leaving school what I wanted to do. I think when I was completing that CAO form, I went back and forth. I think I maxed out my opportunities to change it. And it was funny because I didn't know about HR at that particular point in time. I think I was in my first or second year in my undergrad when I heard of HR. And I always kind of thought that always sort of stands out as being very, very interesting. And I do love it. And it does invigorate me. I love the fact that you're dealing with people, you get all sorts of things and it's not always easy. But it's always a challenge. And it's always different. And I do find myself very lucky to be in something that can be so rewarding. And I mean that, by way of, making a great hire, or, I suppose dealing with a matter in a satisfactory way for all concerned. So I do find myself, that I do really enjoy, 25 years in, I really enjoy that. And, yes, I'm maybe moving more towards the kind of the latter kind of quieter time of my career rather than the earlier stage. But I don't know. I really love that. And I love the fact that the consultancy can evolve in time as well. And, that can change in terms of sort of the amount you're doing, it can change in the amount you're doing, the time that you're doing, you could maybe be taking different breaks. So I suppose overall what I'm saying is I don't know if I will ever have enough. I do really enjoy it.
Is that because you already have enough?
Is that because I already have enough?
But you love what you're doing so much.
I do. Yeah, I do. I do.
Amazing.
And as I said, that doesn't mean I love every day, but I really enjoy it. I think if you want growth, development, a challenge, yes, there's a downside to HR, but there's far more upside.
Amazing. Well, that is the perfect note to end on. So thank you so much for joining me today. And I really appreciate your time.
Thank you so much for having me, Louisa. Thank you.